Hey everyone. All right, so today's pre-class lecture is going to be about latent class models, latent profiles, and latent transition modeling. This is what we're going to be doing this week. This was a request from several of you, so I decided to go this route. So we're going to talk a little bit about latent classes, latent profiles, and latent transition, and then at the end I'm going to give you an example of why we might do this. We're going to hold off on how you test these models until we're actually applying it tomorrow or later this week. But anyway, let's start by talking about latent groups. So far, every time we've talked about latent variables, we've talked about latent variables in the context of some sort of hidden trait or feature that's driving responses on items that we've measured. There is a second type of latent group or latent variable, and that is that within the given population, there are people who simply fall into different types of categories or groups. We have a number of different ways to look at the groups that they fall into. And latent class, latent profile analysis is one way to get at those groups. Um, so when we think about factor analysis, recall that the goal was to identify how a group of particular items kind of hung together, right? And the idea that if these items seem to cluster together, then the same underlying thing is driving them. And we can say the same thing when it comes to latent classes, latent profiles, or latent trajectories, or latent transitions. And that is that there is some underlying aspect of these people that drives their responses on certain items. We'll give an example here in a little bit, or I'll give you an example in a little bit. But there are times when it's more informative to understand whether or not a person is a member of a class or a group than to understand the underlying thing that might be driving their responses on a particular item, like the underlying trait or the underlying feature of that. And I had a great example, and then I thought, nope, that example seems controversial, so I reverted to something else. But let's talk about latent classes. So in latent classes, we assume that there are some sort of hidden groups or classes of people, and that your membership in this class or group drives your response on particular items. This has primarily been used throughout the literature to look at things like diagnostics. Does somebody fall into what we would think of as a diagnostic group? Do they meet depression or not meet depression? And how well does a depression threshold predict membership in some kind of latent group? So in latent class analysis, the idea is that items are not due to an underlying factor, but instead are due to the fact that a person is part of some larger profile or group. And so one way to think about this is I have Walker's part one here, and this is the example that I was trying to come up with. It's not the first example I came up with. Assume that you're trying to determine if somebody is a member of a zombie group or a non-zombie group. You could have a number of categorical indicators. Does the person eat brains, right? If you chop off a person's arm, do they seem okay with it or not, right? Uh, the key here is that do they have a heartbeat? Do they not have a heartbeat? And the idea is the number of yeses or nos will help categorize this person into a latent a latent profile of zombies or not zombies. For those of you who are Walking Dead fans, by the way, this season of The Walking Dead terrible so far. Well, that's my opinion. Let me know if you're a Walking Dead fan in class. I'm curious. The idea, though, here is that you have a bunch of items, categorical items, often dichotomous, but not necessarily dichotomous, that predict whether a person belongs to a certain group. And the probability of endorsing a yes or no response on a given item helps to determine whether they are in a certain group. And so for this, we have these items. Item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and a probability of an endorsing item 1 is 30%, item 2 is roughly 20%, item 3 is low for these green group here, right? And then we have a red group, and everybody in the red group and the blue group endorse item 1 at roughly 100%, right? So we could say that this group down here winds up being like, I don't have 9 questions, but this looks like a group that could be potentially, right, 9 different, or I mean, 9 questions that would assess if you're a zombie or not, and here we've got zombies. Then we've got these other groups here, and perhaps the first question is, do you eat brains? And if the answer to that is no, and both of these groups say no, well then it seems that both of these groups are not zombies yet. Then maybe the next question has something to do with heartbeat, and some of these people do, and some of these people don't, and so maybe what we're talking about here is somebody who's been in this red group bitten by a zombie and is getting ready to become a zombie, but isn't yet, right? And in this other group, we've just got regular humans for one reason or another. And so we wind up using our categorical indicators and our probability of saying yes or no to a given item. We have these 3 kind of basic latent classes: zombies, humans, and humans that have been bitten by zombies. The other feature of latent classes and of latent profiles is that you wind up having to name these groups based on the items that you've asked them, or some other kind of qualitative feature of the group. Then we have latent profile analysis. Latent profile analysis has the same basic assumptions about groups or classes. However, the classes wind up being less distinct. The items used to measure them wind up being more continuous, and the the items you can have a lot more items. The idea is that you're trying to produce a profile, and latent profile analysis is actually what we use oftentimes in personality assessment when we're looking at personality profiles based on the MMPI or something like that. And anyone who's done MMPI work knows that we use these various code types, and those code types are all based on different latent profiles of the MMPI. So here we have a whole bunch of different mean responses to things like active sports, adrenaline sports, passive sports, law. These are people's interest in various things. Not necessarily zombies in this case, but you could pretend like they are if you wanted. And what we see is we get these very kind of distinct profiles. We have this green profile, which is up here, people who just are generally disinterested in academia or academic pursuits. And then we have a red profile, right, where you see dips down here in things like theater, writing, and reading goes up a little bit and then back down to politics. And then they shoot way up here for biology, chemistry, dip back down for mathematics, and then back up for medicine, physics, and so on. And then economy is down here. These wind up being science-based people, right? And you can see that they're endorsing quite a bit of interest in science on some sort of continuous level. Then we have arts and humanities people that are endorsing a lot of interest over here in things like theater, writing, reading, etc. And so we have distinct profiles of people who are interested in science, who are interested in arts and humanities, and so on and so forth. The nice thing with profile analysis, as I said, you can have a lot more indicators and still have very stable parameter estimates. The last that we're going to talk about, and we're only going to talk about it briefly, is latent transition analysis. And so latent transition analysis assumes that people move from one group to another across time. And you can use both categorical and continuous indicators. And for latent profile analysis, by the way, you can also use both categorical and continuous indicators. And in the context of M+, they're very, very similar. We'll talk about that in class this week. From our Walker example, right, we might find that we initially have kind of three groups. Let's flip back here. And then across time, like this might be what our groups look like at time 1, but then at time 2, we see a very different pattern where our red all of a sudden match our green, right? And they're kind of matching green now. And so latent transition analysis just allows for us to model the fact that reds become greens at some future point in time. Latent transition analysis requires you to have two sets of data, prospective data, linked data across time, whereas latent class and latent profile analysis do not. Those all can be done using basic cross-sectional data. All right, so why do it? Well, here's a latent profile analysis that we did using items of the audit. And you can see we were able to come up with kind of 6 very distinct types or profiles of college student drinkers. Perhaps the most interesting thing here is we wind up having a lot of heavy drinkers. This is consumption level, though we have 2 kind of groups or profiles of low consumption folks. And then it's 1 really, really low consumption folks, and they don't have any problems or very mild problems. Then we have our moderate people who also have very few problems. And then we have our heavy, actually what's interesting is one of these moderate people, we have seen others are concerned in them. And if we were doing a latent transition analysis, I have a feeling that this profile right here would be one that's getting ready to transition to this profile here. And this profile is our heavy drinking people with severe problems. Note that we have 3 heavy drinking groups. You can see them right here. Here's our 3 heavy drinking groups. One of these heavy drinking groups right here seems to drink an awful lot and have very few problems. They do have some memory loss and blackouts, but they are drinking a lot, right? In contrast, we have a heavy drinking group who has all kinds of issues with loss of control and failure to fulfill obligations. These are 2 diagnostic features of alcohol dependence, but they don't have physical dependence. There's something about them that alcohol is not reinforcing. Then it jumps back up and they've had feelings of guilt, blackout, injured others and such. Then we have this very interesting group that has lower levels of loss of control and failure to fulfill obligations, but then higher levels of physical dependence. Now, the interesting piece of this is both of these groups would be diagnosed with alcohol dependence, but they're very different types of people, right? We have this group who doesn't seem to be having loss of control and doesn't seem to be having the same social issues that this group does, but they are extremely physically addicted to alcohol. And so the target for this group versus this group, despite having the same diagnosis, would be different, and this profile, identifying these profiles, allows you to do that. One of the other things it does is it allows you to look at differences in various risk factors. And so in this analysis, which we just got to revise and resubmit this week, we looked at alcohol-related expectancies and the extent to which people's expectancies, this is what they think will happen when they drink, are organized along these kind of axes of arousing versus sedating and social, pro-social versus antisocial. And we see that like light drinkers, moderate drinkers, and even heavy drinkers tend to be clustered around this pro-social thing. They drink because it's fun to be around other people and it's a good time. In contrast, as people transition, regardless of whether the amount that they're drinking, we have moderate drinkers up here with severe problems, and interestingly, they're getting pulled closer towards this arousing, sedating axis. If you look at moderate drinkers with mild problems versus moderate drinkers with severe problems, it's a big shift in their activation patterns. In fact, moderate drinkers with severe problems have a shift greater than heavy drinkers with mild problems. So it seems that problems tend to push people this way. We also see severe problems here in heavy drinkers is even closer, but as you might expect, people who are drinking because they have physical addiction are drinking primarily for the arousing and sedating effects of alcohol. All right, that is it for today. I will see you guys later on this week, and we will start digging into latent class and latent profile models.